She entered the mess hall with silent steps, as if she didn't want to take up space. The desert heat permeated every corner of Fort Ashbury, Arizona, but Mae Whitlock, 41, walked dressed in a heavy, antique military coat with frayed seams and faded embroidery. Around her, the cadets wore training shirts sweating under the ceiling fan. She seemed out of place, like a misplaced page in a modern manual, and perhaps that was exactly what she was. Some young people chuckled softly. Others watched her with disdain, barely hiding their comments. That coat should be in a museum. Does she think she's still at war? Someone tells you it's past time to retire. Mae didn't react. Her eyes remained fixed on the tray in front of her, where she lined up each item with almost surgical precision. Cutlery, bread, glass of juice. But anyone paying attention would have noticed her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, nor from anger. It was something deeper. A tension that seemed to have roots in places none of those cadets had even imagined. She sat in the corner of the room, as she did every day. Away from the hubbub, away from the stares. But her coat was there, as always, motionless, zipped up to the neck, with a button missing from the right cuff, the same button she used to touch with her thumb whenever she was silent. To most of them, Mae was just a displaced veteran, someone hired to help with tactical simulations, but whose time had passed to be replaced by someone more up-to-date. She barely spoke. She avoided unnecessary interactions, and when she did, her voice was firm, but with a certain slowness, as if she had seen time differently. It was hard for the young people to understand that she carried more than just appearance. She carried memory, pain, and a silent promise. But no one at that base knew that, yet. That morning something changed. The cadets' chatter was interrupted by firm footsteps. Captain Harlan, newly arrived at Fort Ashbury, strode through the mess hall with the authority of someone who thrives on being noticed, young, ambitious, and tough, and with a list of changes in hand. New conduct guidelines, he announced. During training and simulations, all civilian and military instructors must wear the standard uniform. No old or affectionate items. We're dealing with real security. The warning was for everyone, but the captain's eyes were fixed on her. Mae slowly looked up. Then he looked back at the tray, as if the rule simply didn't affect her. What the captain didn't know, and no one in that room could have imagined, was that that coat, sweaty and silent, was all that remained of a story that had never been told aloud. The next day, the cadets were more agitated. They whispered, betting on whether she would finally comply. Some laughed, others waited for trouble. But when Mae walked through the gates again, the coat was there. Same model, same condition, same silence. The captain, visibly irritated, intercepted her before she even reached the training area. I told you the uniform was mandatory. Take off that coat, now. The sun beat down on the rocks at the base. The heat was almost unbearable, but she didn't give in. I can't, sir. What do you mean you can't? Are you disobeying a direct order? Mae kept her eyes fixed. This coat, it's all I have. Cadets began to approach. What had been a private confrontation was becoming a public scene. And in that moment, something felt different about her. It wasn't arrogance or pride, it was a contained pain, wrapped in layers of discipline and memory. She reached for the zipper on her coat. Slowly. No rush. Like someone about to open not just a piece of clothing, but a portal to the past. Stay with me until the end. What was under that coat wasn't just a tattoo. It was a truth no one was ready to see. And what happened in the next few minutes would change the way the entire base looked at her, forever. The sun had barely touched the dry ground of the base when the news spread like wildfire. An audit was underway. It was the kind of news that made the corridors quieter and eyes more suspicious. Some whispered that documents were missing. Others spoke of a leak of classified data. No one knew for sure what was happening, only that everything was about to change. That morning, Captain Harlan stepped onto the small platform at Center Court, clipboard in hand, his expression one of authority like a badge of honor. Tall, rigid, too young for his position, and too eager to prove his worth. He looked at the row of civilians, instructors, assistants, retired technicians. Among them there stood Mae, standing straight, silent in the coat that seemed to have become part of her skin. "New directive immediately," he said bluntly. "Throughout the simulation period, all civilian contractors must wear the approved standard uniform. This includes removing any vintage, personalized, or emotionally worn items. We're dealing with safety, not nostalgia." Silence fell like a thick tarp over the courtyard. No one dared to disagree. No one, except her. Mae said nothing. Didn't react, didn't raise her hand or even blink. She just stood there as stiff as ever. But inside, something hurt. It hurt with the force of memories no one around her would ever carry. When everyone was dismissed, the captain descended the steps and walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, imposing his presence, as if proximity were enough to intimidate. "Did you understand the order, Sergeant?" She looked up slowly. "I understand, sir." The answer came clean, precise, but completely devoid of regret. The next day at 7:04 a.m., Mae walked through the main gates exactly as she had for years. Same firm stride, same frown, same coat. That was enough. The base radio had barely transmitted the day's first alert when the captain appeared furiously in the yard. The cadets stopped training. Some laughed, others simply stopped to watch the spectacle. And there, in the middle of an unfinished formation, the confrontation began. "What's this? Do you think it's an exception?" Mae stopped. She took a deep breath. "It's not about that, sir." "So what is it about?" She hesitated. The answer seemed ready, but it didn't come. It was as if suddenly there was no air. The captain continued. "You are disobeying a direct order. I will not repeat it." She answered softly, but each word cut like a razor. "This coat has already saved more lives than anyone here knows." Most of them laughed. One of the recruits made a crude comment. Another imitated her gesture of touching the missing button on his sleeve. Contempt hung in the air, viscous, uncomfortable. But no one knew. Absolutely no one there had any idea what that coat really meant. Inside, Mae relived things that had never been spoken aloud. The desert heat paled in comparison to the red sand where she had crawled with a torn shoulder and a broken leg to pull an unconscious Marine out of a minefield. The same coat she was now wearing had been used to staunch his bleeding until the helicopter arrived. She never told him that. Not a line, not a word. But that wasn't all. It was the night her platoon was ambushed in the fog, and she was the only one who returned. It was the day she had to listen over the radio to the last breath of a comrade who couldn't be saved. It was the uniform she wore when she had to choose between completing the mission or breaking orders to save civilians. And it broke. That's why she was never promoted. That's why it was forgotten. In the present, the captain stepped forward. The crowd fell silent. He extended his hand. "Last chance. Take off that coat." Mae looked around. No sympathetic glances, no outstretched hands, just silence and anticipation. And then, with a slow movement, as if unearthing a ghost, she began to unzip the zipper. 1, 2, 3 teeth of the clasp slipped. The fabric creaked. And there, between the heat and the shame, something appeared. The sleeve slid down, revealing part of her shoulder. And on the shoulder, marked on the skin with the precision of someone who never wanted to be seen, an eagle with outspread wings, 3 stars on its chest and a dagger in its talons. Below, an inscription in ancient Latin. The captain's eyes widened, paralyzed. He recognized that symbol. He knew exactly what that meant, but to the others around, it was still just a tattoo. What no one there knew, what not even the records at that base contained, was what that mark represented. A forgotten unit, a group that operated without a name, without a flag, without records. Mae wasn't just a veteran. She had been part of something beyond the comprehension of those who laughed at her now. And that was just the first sign. A few meters behind, an older sergeant who rarely spoke seemed petrified, his eyes fixed on the mark as if seeing a ghost. And as he approached, he murmured, almost voiceless, "That mark, it's not possible." It was at that moment that the silence fell in a different way. It was no longer mockery. It was tension. It was the beginning of something none of them were prepared to witness. Write in the comments, Not all past is in the archives, because the story that follows changes everything. The sound of the zipper sliding split the silence in two. It was a simple, mechanical sound, but at that moment it sounded like a dam breaking. Each revealed metal tooth seemed to also open a crack in something larger, something Mae had carried for years, locked away tightly inside her. Around her, no one moved. Not even the most irreverent cadets dared blink. The sun beat down firmly on the stones of the training yard, but the chill that ran down some of their spines didn't come from the desert. It came from what they saw emerging just below the collar of their coats. When the fabric fell from her shoulders, it turned out to be a tattoo that didn't follow conventional patterns. It wasn't art. It was a symbol. It was code. The black eagle with outspread wings and 3 stars on its chest wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a seal. And the ribbon wrapped around its talons, bearing the motto "Honor through shadows," was known to very few. Captain Harlan took a step back. Just one. But it was enough for everyone to realize something was out of control. He tried to maintain authority on his face, but his eyes had already betrayed the expression. A senior sergeant, rarely noticed on the base, stepped out of the shadows of the hangar and approached slowly, as if treading on sacred ground. He said nothing. He simply glanced at Mae's exposed shoulder and bowed his head, as if paying respects to a grave. Confusion formed in silence. It was as if everyone had understood there was a detail in her past that no one there could fit together, a piece missing from the puzzle, and the more they looked, the more they felt they were looking at someone they couldn't decipher. But the captain tried to resist. "That doesn't change anything. You're still disobeying an order." Mae looked up for the first time. And for the first time since arriving at the base, she spoke firmly. "Captain, I've been obeying orders since before you could march. I've seen soldiers beg to die and others tear themselves apart for their country without ever being remembered. This coat isn't vanity. It's all I have left of what war took from me." And then she pointed with her chin to the tattoo. "That symbol isn't in any manual, because most of the missions it represents haven't even been acknowledged. I was a member of Falcon Echo-One, and if you need to research what that is, then maybe you don't have the authority to tell me to take anything down." His breath hitched. But, like any man who fears losing command, Harlan reacted violently. "You are removed. Effective immediately. Turn in your badge and leave this base." Mae remained motionless, not out of defiance, but because the weight of his words was just one of many she'd already carried. In 2004, she had received a medal in a secret ceremony, attended by only 2 officers and with no photographic evidence. 2 years later, her name was erased from a report on an infiltration mission in Afghanistan. Since then, her existence has been a footnote in classified documents, and now she was being treated as a threat for wearing a coat that silently bore all the names left behind. As she walked toward the barracks, head held high, the recruits moved aside without realizing it. It was as if they instinctively knew they were no longer facing the woman they'd considered outdated, but something greater, someone who, despite her silence, carried a hidden truth that none of them would ever truly understand. She entered the dorm and locked the door. She sat on the bed as she had for years. She looked at the wall where she kept a small bulletin board of old clippings, names, dates, scratched-out maps. Nothing anyone outside would understand. But to her, each piece of paper represented a life, a moment, a decision. She knew she'd reached the end there, that they were trying to erase her once again. But something inside her also knew that this time, she wasn't the only one carrying the doubt. Now, someone had seen, someone had been scared, and that changed everything. During the night, a metallic noise woke her. An envelope was pushed under the door. It had no return address, no stamp, just a note. "The truth still has allies. Be ready." The next morning she didn't show up at the courtyard, or the mess hall, or the observation tower where she usually reviewed protocols, and it was precisely her absence that made more of an impact than any presence. The captain tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but he couldn't ignore the whispers. Some recruits began researching military forums, others chatted among themselves about the eagle symbol, and a small group, led by the senior sergeant, began to gather in silence in front of the hangar late in the afternoon. Something had changed at the base, and it wasn't just the weather. Deep down, Mae knew this public exposure wasn't for nothing. She'd been cornered, but somehow the base itself was reacting, not by orders but by memory, by intuition, by quiet justice. And even isolated in the barracks, she knew the impact had begun. If this story touched you, comment below. Not all respect needs sound. And there is a part that has not yet been revealed, because now the story will enter a point that few would have the courage to tell. The silence that morning wasn't the same silence as always. It wasn't the muffled din of military routine or rigid discipline. It was the kind of silence that traps the breath in your lungs, that silences even those who normally talk too much. Mae was still zipping up her coat when Sergeant Oldham, the oldest man on the base and the most ignored, stepped forward. He hadn't said a word in days. Many thought he couldn't even hear properly anymore. But, faced with the tattoo on Mae's shoulder, he stopped. He stood still and murmured as if seeing a ghost, "That mark. That's from the Falcon Echo-One." The words weren't met with immediate shock. Most of them had no idea what it was. Echo-One wasn't in pamphlets, nor in accessible archives, nor even in military school records. It was a name whispered among very old veterans, always with a certain wariness in their eyes. A name that wasn't mentioned in tributes, nor on plaques, nor on medals. The young cadet who dared to ask, "What is Falcon Echo-One?" did not get a straight answer. Mae had already zipped up her coat. Her eyes were different now, no longer tired, but fixed, alert, as if something inside her had awakened. Captain Harlan swallowed hard, but tried to maintain his composure. He tried to tell her it meant nothing, that she was still breaking the rules, but no one else was listening, because the center of attention was now different. For the next few minutes, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The recruits' looks, previously mocking, were now filled with doubt, with discomfort, with genuine curiosity. They had seen something they couldn't explain, but it carried weight, real weight, of an untold story. Mae returned to the dorm. She said nothing. She didn't protest, she didn't cry. But as soon as she turned the key in the door and leaned her head against the cold wall, a silent wave washed over her, a kind of exhaustion only experienced by those who have endured years of silence and humiliation. She let herself slide to the floor, knees bent, and stood there, hands on her face, trying to contain a tremor that didn't come from outside. During the night, no one knocked on his door, but the base's hallways seemed more alert. Something had changed, not visibly. There were still sidelong glances and whispers, but the energy was different. A newer recruit, the same one who had made jokes days earlier, left a sealed bag of food on the front chair in the mess hall. Nobody saw who put it, and no one had the courage to take it away. The next morning, Captain Harlan summoned her to a formal meeting with the base's top brass. He called it protocol, but everyone knew it was something else. It was fear disguised as a rule, because apparently someone up there had also heard the name Echo-One and recognized the brand. Mae showed up on time. Her uniform was clean, her posture firm, her eyes downcast, but her coat still on her. The room was filled with familiar faces, lieutenants, department heads, administrative officers, but everyone seemed different now, more restrained, more careful. Only one of them spoke. "We need to understand what's going on here, Ms. Whitlock. This base values transparency." She faced the man with the calm of someone who had already endured much worse interrogations. "Transparency?" She opened the briefcase she had brought with her. From inside, she took out a single sheet, yellowed with a watermark that only trained eyes could recognize. "This is a gag order signed in 2007 by the Joint Force Advanced Operations Directorate. I have copies in Washington, Norfolk, and Quantico. You can dispute it, but you can't delete it." The sheet of paper rolled across the table to the center of the room, and there at the bottom, a signature sent chills down the spines of 3 of those present. She didn't need to say anything else, but he said, For years I wore that coat because it was all I had left. All they couldn't confiscate, erase, classify, or archive. When they took away my credits, my rank, and even my colleagues, they left that. And now they want to take it away too? Harlan pressed his lips together. He wanted to intervene, but he couldn't. The room was dominated by another force, a force that came not from rank, but from the hidden truth that was now beginning to emerge. The base commander, who had not spoken up until then, finally spoke. His voice was deep and measured. "Sergeant Whitlock, is there anything else you would like to say?" She looked up. And for the first time, there was not just pain in them, but clarity. "I don't want to talk about myself, but you should know that there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, of soldiers who returned home without a name, without a story, and without honor. Some are still alive, others died in oblivion, and if an old coat bothers you so much, perhaps it's because it reminds you of what you pretended to forget." She stood up before the meeting ended. No one had the courage to tell her to sit down, or hold the document, or ask for her coat. And what happened after that meeting, it was unexpected even for her. Comment here. Truth doesn't disappear, it waits. Because you have something about to happen, and the entire base will feel it. The hinges of the old shed creaked softly as Mae pushed the metal door open with her shoulder. The Arizona sun beat down brightly outside, but inside was shadow, dust, and the past stored in forgotten boxes. The base maintained this space as a repository for obsolete equipment, unused cables, and old records no one read anymore. To everyone else, it was a dead end. To her, it was the only place that still knew her true name. Mae walked to the back, where a grey cabinet had stood untouched for over a decade. Rusted on the sides, it still held what remained of her real identity. With a key attached to a lanyard around her neck, she unlocked the padlock and pulled open the door. Inside, the mementos weren't organized by date or title, they were by wound. Every folder, every clipping, every medal with the black stripe pasted over the name or mission was a reminder that she existed, and that they tried to make the world forget. She sat on the concrete floor, crossed her legs, and began leafing through the files with the slowness of someone rereading scars. A letter stamped with the Joint Force seal, discreetly, thanking her for her service. A piece of her combat uniform, ripped at the ribs, still stained with dirt and rust. And in the background, hidden beneath everything, a black and white portrait. 3 mud-stained faces, one holding a prisoner with a broken arm, the other, her, standing, weapon dropped at her side, eyes fixed straight ahead. The caption on the back was faded but still visible. Recovery complete. 72 hours after the ambush. 0 support, 0 coverage. 3 lives saved. It was on that mission that Mae disappeared. Officially, she was declared dead at the end of the 2nd day. A drone recorded the explosion of an enemy hideout, and no one believed she could have survived. She was alive. But no one searched. For 3 days, she dragged one of the prisoners with a blown-off leg and another unconscious along the banks of a dry valley, with their ammunition nearly empty, their water divided into bottle caps, and a bullet lodged in their right shoulder. There was no radio, no backup, only her. And the coat she wore today was the same one that had covered those 2 men during the freezing nights, when the desert turned to ice, and the sound of gunfire still echoed in their heads. When she finally reached an evacuation point, bleeding, speechless, her face burned by the sun and her eyes sunken from exhaustion, she was met by 2 uniformed men who didn't even know her name. One of them, checking her military badge still pinned to her uniform, simply said, "You should be dead." She replied, "They are still alive." But this gesture, heroic, almost impossible, didn't lead to a story, a promotion, or even internal recognition. Instead, she was called into a meeting with 3 officers where she was told the operation had been reclassified to extreme secrecy, that nothing she did could be associated with her name, that she would receive a temporary mental health discharge and, with luck, could return to duty as an instructor. Silent, discreet, invisible. And that's what she did. But he never accepted. Mae looked at the mural she'd improvised on one of the warehouse walls. It wasn't a mural of achievements, it was a shrine to losses. There were the names of her comrades who'd disappeared silently, of the civilians she'd saved without anyone noticing, of the choices she'd had to make when there was no time to think, only to act. Everything was organized with pins, as if that would help keep the story alive. As she watched, a memory washed over her like a wave. Her last conversation with Captain Rowan, her leader at Echo-One, moments before the helicopter departed for the mission. Mae had hesitated. She said something wasn't right. Rowan grabbed her arm and said, "If it goes wrong, protect the living. And if you come back, be the kind of ghost that bothers the living for the rest of your life." She hadn't forgotten, and now, more than ever, it was time to bother him. When he left the shed, it was already night. The Arizona sky was clear, and the crickets seemed to be chirping louder than usual. She walked through the base in silence, but this time she felt something different in the air. The presence of something I couldn't explain, perhaps the beginning of a turning point, perhaps the end of invisibility. And then, without warning, a black jeep drove through the base gates with its headlights off. It stopped a few meters from where she stood. Two figures got out, one in ceremonial Air Force uniform, the other, she knew. White hair, firm posture, a gold badge pinned to his breast pocket. He didn't say his name. He just took off his cap and saluted. Little by little, the soldiers in the surrounding area did the same. No explanation, no order, only respect, silent, delayed, deep. Mae didn't cry, but inside her, something finally gave way. Years of silence began to give way to something new. Perhaps justice. Write it down. She didn't forget. The world erased it. Because what will happen now will leave marks on those who always thought that honor was just an old word. The sound of boots echoing on the concrete of the courtyard was the first sign that the day would be different. It was early. The sky still had that whitish hue of warm Arizona mornings, and the base was slowly waking up. But the military jeep that rolled through the gates was no ordinary one. It was black, armored, with a coat of arms that most soldiers had only seen at high-ranking ceremonies, and even then, from afar. When he stopped in the center of the courtyard, the conversations ceased. Recruits who were playing ball stopped their game. Maintenance technicians dropped their tools on the ground. The silence that fell wasn't one of fear, nor of obligation. It was a silence of instinct. Something in the air told him this was big, that someone important had arrived. And when the jeep door opened, that impression was confirmed. The man who descended wore an impeccable ceremonial uniform. His hair was gray and neatly trimmed. His posture was straight as a beam. He wasn't young, but he exuded presence. The kind of figure who didn't need to raise his voice to command a space. Era O General T.R. Callahan, a veteran of multiple campaigns, decorated with the Silver Star, known for his discretion, and absolutely ruthless in the face of silent injustice. He didn't speak to anyone. He walked directly toward the women's quarters, flanked by two base soldiers. When he reached Mae's door, he asked them not to knock. He turned the doorknob himself. She was open. Mae stood making the bed. There was no surprise on her face. Just that constant serenity she carried with someone who had lost more than she could count. When she saw the general enter, she straightened her shoulders, but didn't touch her forehead. She waited, in silence. The general looked at her for long seconds, and then he saluted. The gesture was dry, straight, precise. And as he lowered his hand, he said loudly, loud enough to echo through the corridors that opened up beyond, "This woman carried the honor of the country when no one else could. You should be learning from her." Two recruits peering out the window sighed. A sergeant leaning against the doorframe raised his hand to his head in a sign of respect, even though he hadn't been called upon. Gradually, like a domino effect, the soldiers began to line up in the courtyard. No one gave orders. It was spontaneous. Mae didn't cry, but his eyes for the first time shone. The general then approached, lower now. He spoke only to her. "I got a call from Washington. A name I thought I'd never hear again. Yours." He took an envelope from his inside jacket pocket and handed it to her. Inside was a single sheet. It was a memo, classified, but with the seal newly changed to disclosable upon personal release. The content, still covered in blackouts, officially released the mention of Falcon Echo-One for public ceremonies and records. That wasn't all, but it was a start. Mae took a deep breath. And in that moment, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had disappeared into the background of history, about every soldier whose name was not mentioned, about every life-saving mission that was buried under the guise of national security. In the cafeteria, where days before she had been the target of low-brow jokes, the atmosphere was different. The laughter disappeared. The chairs now turned towards the door, and when Mae crossed the hall, accompanied by the general, the same cadets who had previously mocked her stood up, not by imposition but out of respect. One of them shyly approached. He was holding a metal box, small, rusty. Mae recognized her immediately. It was the box she herself had left in the warehouse years ago, thinking she'd never have the courage to open it again. Inside were 3 dog tags. They belonged to soldiers she couldn't save. A folded letter and a damaged photo of the team that never returned. The cadet held out the box. "This is yours, ma'am. It was among the old equipment. I thought you should know." She took the box as if taking a piece of her own chest, and this time, for a brief second, his eyes closed. Not to hide pain, but to hold back the impact of something that for so long seemed impossible, be seen. That afternoon a special meeting was called. In the base's main auditorium, the seats were packed. The general took the floor, but before saying anything, he made a simple gesture. He called Mae up to the stage. She hesitated, but it was. He climbed the steps with firm steps, the coat still on the body. The tattoo was now known, and the name so many had tried to erase, was finally standing. Fan site, comment here. To be remembered is the greatest form of justice. And if you thought this story had already revealed everything, just wait until you see who shows up at the ceremony. The sound of boots on the base's rough ground was the same again. The same as always, and yet completely different. Mae walked through the courtyard with the same stride she always had, steady, controlled, silent. But now, each footstep seemed to resonate with a different kind of presence. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to draw attention, and yet eyes followed her, not with mockery but with respect, a respect that wasn't imposed, it was built. In the main hallway, 2 cadets stopped their conversation when they saw her pass. One of them, the same one who had imitated her gesture with his coat button days ago, now rose from his chair and greeted her with a restrained, almost embarrassed wave. The other held out a bottle of water, which she declined with a slight but not cold wave. She knew what that meant. She knew what they were trying to do. And even though I didn't say anything, I also felt inside what that represented. Deep down, it wasn't about glory. It never was. Mae carried the awareness that there is no heroism without wounds, no justice without silence. She had lost so much over the years, recognition, her official uniform, trust in the system, but now something was being returned, a piece of what had been taken away, not by decree, but by neglect. And that piece wasn't physical. It was identity. Near the base's main entrance, a flurry of activity caught attention. Several soldiers were gathered around a new frame, recently installed on the Wall of Honor. It was discreet, unlike the others that highlighted medals, dates, or awards. In the image, Mae appeared in profile, her coat zipped up to her neck, her eyes focused on the horizon. No pose, no smile, just truth. And below the photo, a simple phrase, engraved in matte silver. Sergeant Mae Whitlock, Falcon Echo-One Unit. Discretion is invisible courage. No ceremony was held, no fanfare. But the photo there, in that space where so many important names were competing for space, was, in itself, a revolution. In the barracks, she went back to organizing her things as she always did. He folded his jacket carefully and placed it on the chair. Even accepted, it was still a piece of war, and even respected, it was still a burden. But now, it was also a symbol. And for the first time, she felt like she could perhaps put it aside, not by imposition, but by choice. In the cafeteria, The seats around her were no longer empty. Cadets approached with doubts, questions, even insecurities. One of them, a newbie, asked how she dealt with fear. She didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "You don't deal, you carry." And the boy nodded, as if he understood more than he seemed to. Even Captain Harlan, since the general's arrival, seemed different. Not from any real change, but from embarrassment. The report he had prepared to remove Mae was quietly shelved without fanfare. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew. Harlan began to avoid the same spaces as her. You never apologized. He never looked you in the eye. But when he passed her in the observation tower and noticed Mae briefing a group of cadets on advanced tactical protocols, he turned away in silence. Some battles are won with words, others with time, and some with simple permanence. The turning point had indeed happened, but not like a war movie with a soundtrack. The transformation there was silent. It was in the eyes of others. It was in the way she became a role model, even without changing a single iota of who she was. At night, alone in the shed where she kept her story, Mae turned on a flashlight and sat on the concrete floor. Beside her was the old box containing the dog tags of her lost companions. She cleaned them one by one, as if speaking to each of them. They didn't erase you, not completely. He placed the 3 in a line on the table, and next to it, he wrote the names, with firm handwriting. No abbreviations, no stripes. Outside, the desert wind fluttered the base flag, and for a brief moment Mae closed her eyes and allowed herself to breathe lightly. Write in the comments, some victories don't make noise, because sometimes the greatest cry for justice comes from those who choose to remain silent. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched a chord deep inside you, perhaps a value that's been forgotten, perhaps a kind of courage that doesn't usually make the rounds. This channel exists precisely for that, to remind you that there are silences that deserve to be heard, and stories that still need to be told. So if this content resonated with you, if it sparked some reflection or kept you engaged until the end, leave a comment with the following phrase: "I saw it through to the end because it matters." Take advantage and subscribe to the channel. That way you can continue following real or inspired stories that remind us of what's worth carrying. Oh, and if you could leave a like, it really helps us continue our mission of giving a voice to those who are rarely heard. And hey, there's a video right here that complements this topic in a special way. Click and stay with me there. I'm sure it will also make an impact on you in a way you didn't expect.